When a Counter-Strike team falls, the first to take the blame are the players. Whether it's the IGL, the unfortunate support, or the coach who just couldn't find another superstar, there's always someone who is going to get burned at the stake. But is it always their fault? What we as fans don't see are the constraints each lineup is working under. We don't see behind the scenes, and thus most of the time we miss the culprit that is often the most impactful, the organization. While some organizations act more like a sponsor in a hands-off manner, leaving roster moves to the players and coaches, others like to get their hands dirty. They leave nothing to chance, and unfortunately, that's often exactly where things go completely off the rails. Whether it's just good intentions or pure old-fashioned I know better ego from owners and upper management, some decisions get made despite fierce pushback from the players and from basic common sense in my experience. And when control stretches beyond its domain of competence, everything starts to crumble. Layoffs, players getting sold, possible bankruptcy, and the inevitable lessons being learned. I mean, unless you just have an infinite money pit and then you can just keep f***ing up like your heart desires. That's why Russian organization Virtus.pro stands as one of the greatest examples of how bad management can fumble even the best of hands. Despite practically infinite budgets, they've wasted countless opportunities, ruined player careers, killed legendary major winning cores, and even destroyed long-standing friendships. And of course, they managed to do all of that more than once. Allow me to walk you through the incompetence and pure foolishness that led to one of the greatest sequence of fuck-ups in Counter-Strike history. Welcome to the fall of Virtus.pro. Let's go back in time. VP are a well-established organization in Counter-Strike, with top-level tournament appearances going back as far as 2004. But our story today begins at the end of the 1.6 era. Their transition to CSGO actually featured some good Eastern European players, most notably Angel, Doja, and Guardian. They were the very first team to beat the legendary NIP squad, ending their 87-0 LAN streak. But that's a footer to an otherwise unremarkable tenure. In July 2013, it was announced that VP were going to drop the roster and exit CSGO. News regarding this move is lost media. The only thing that was stated in HLTV's coverage of the incident was that VP's original announcement stated that the team haven't fulfilled their obligations to the team, which is a rather vague red flag. What were those obligations? Well, your guess is as good as mine. For the org, they would take some time away from CS until near the end of the year, where their identity would change drastically. Meanwhile, Poland had a significant team lead the charge during the 1.6 years. Originally forming as Team Pentagram in 2004, this legendary team had captured a multitude of titles across a period of 8 years, an extended period of excellence that had them dubbed the Golden Five. Despite the success, the Wild West era of the scene at the time still left the Golden Five with multiple challenges, particularly with scammy organizations. Fortunately for them, that was about to come to a permanent end in January of 2014. Virtus.pro were still teamless at the time, and the Poles had established quite a year-ending blockbuster, and with this success, VP swooped in to pick them up, believing that they had the chops to do well at their home nation major in EMS1 Katowice. Yeah, believe it or not, that whole tournament cycle was the first tournament that VP had with the Poles, and what a start it was. The players talked about their motivation after their title win, where it felt like nothing could ever drive a wedge between them. VP managed to stay a strong contender in Tier 1 for a while, but their form started dipping in 2016. They had some playoff placings in Tier 1 lands, but that was overshadowed by numerous far earlier exits. Among all of them, no attempts to shift their strategy were made, outside of a couple internal role changes that only seemed to delay the inevitable and actually damage their local Polish scene. Put a pin in that, I'll elaborate on it a little bit later. With the popularity of the players in the community and more returns coming out of their Twitch streams, it felt like Virtus.pro management would rather leverage that than try and make the team better. Season 3 of the ESL Pro League is, for me at least, the most egregious example of this. Allegedly. Pro League was one of the biggest Tier 1 events back then, and VP were facing auto-relegation after a disastrous season. Conveniently, ESL expanded the league and introduced a one-off fan vote for a wildcard promotion match. Obviously, VP won the vote easily and got matched up against Godsent, who they barely beat. This allowed them to keep their spot in Pro League, but the circumstances surrounding it looked highly suspicious. Well, you see, VP were owned by ES Force Holdings, who also owned Epicenter, a tournament operator, and CSGO Lounge, a skins betting website which had pretty good market dominance over esports viewership. For those of you not in the know, getting a match listed on CSGO Lounge in 2016 was a necessity for TOs at the time. So imagine how a parent organization could leverage this monopoly to force their team back into the league. I know, it sounds like a complete conspiracy theory, and whilst there is no smoking gun, media at the time heavily intimates behind the scenes that this might have just happened. I mean, why else would ESL create a promotion path to their flagship league that has never existed before or since? This possibility casts a dark shadow over all of VP's achievements at the time. They won the inaugural season of E-League, they took a title at DreamHack Open Bucharest, qualified for the finals of WESG, and placed second of Epicenter's inaugural event. You know, the event that's owned by ES Force. For the most part though, it would seem that they were in the perfect form for the biggest tournament of the year, the E-League Atlanta Major. What a time to be alive as a CS fan. We witnessed Astralis begin their era, we saw FaZe be pretty terrible, so I guess not much has changed there, and the Polish powerhouse were at full strength. Despite the suspicions surrounding the organisation, fan support for the players never wavered, and they delivered an epic but ultimately failing effort in the major final against Astralis. At the time, it felt like they were still on an upswing though. This team was poised and prepared to deliver something special. It was just a matter of time. Then management tried to apply the brakes. Okay, I can't put any more stupid car puns in here. Let's talk about the Mercedes. VP, CEO, manager, owner type figure was a guy called Snez, and Snez decided that he needed to motivate his boys to win after the loss in Atlanta. So he took to publicly stating that he'll reward a player on the team with a new Mercedes if they won DreamHack Masters in Vegas. Cool, right? This actually presents a few problems. First of all, CS is a team game. If you want to motivate your team to do well, then wouldn't it make most sense to reward, you know, the whole team? Secondly, it's a reward that contradicts the org's previous actions. I mentioned before that the players' streams were a more viable vertical than the team itself, and nobody benefited more from this than Pasha. In later years, he revealed in interviews that his streams were so popular that they attracted sponsors to him directly, sponsors that he was forced to pass on to VP. He was never given a bonus for this, with VP citing their policy to reward all players equally in salaries and bonuses. So if that was the org's policy at the time, why the hell did they dream this up? Thirdly, the player that got the car was Taz, who arguably had one of the worst performances of anyone on VP at that tournament. The general sentiment from team members was that if anyone, Neo should have gotten the car as he was the IGL at the time, and he felt particularly aggrieved about this. So being the great teammate that he was, Taz accepted the car, even posing for it on social media. Now that I'm reading that out loud, it just sounds so ridiculous, doesn't it? I realize we're making a huge deal about a car here, but that is actually for very good reason. Multiple interviews with players and coaches over the years have pointed to this very moment as the beginning of the end for this team. And it just makes you look at the management and ask, why? It's no wonder that players remember being demotivated during this period. Bialy got so much shit for playing more PUBG than CS in 2017.
Paweł Bielinski, Bialy, PUBG player.
But can you blame him? His employers are claiming to want to treat him as an equal, but their actions demonstrate the total opposite. And as 2017 rolled on, VP had some disastrous moments hit them. Most tournament exits were early, with the only highlights coming from the Adrenaline Cyber League title and Epicenter final, both organised by that parent company, by the way, and the Star Ladder Invitational, in which they still couldn't even beat the Australian Renegades. And among all this, in the face of common criticism and sense, VP made no roster changes, no staff changes, no changes of any regard, really. And as they continued to waste everybody's time by doing nothing in the competitive circuit, their popularity began dwindling. After they placed last in the New Legends stage of the Boston Major, they finally made changes to the starting five, replacing Taz with Mihu, but this came far too late. Remember when I said that VP's inaction actively damaged the Polish scene? Well, this is the part where that all comes back to bite them in the arse. Poland was actually not short of tier 2 teams and players, but the very few promising ones were never really given the room to develop into the tier 1 talents that they could have been. This was before the international team meta, so opportunities to move to a better squad had to come from the tier 1 squads of that region. With Virtus.pro being the only top Polish team, they were effectively single-handed in stagnating the entire Polish scene. So when they finally started to make changes, it didn't really help that much. Without an effective, long-standing talent pipeline, VP basically shot themselves in the foot in 2016, only realized they were bleeding by 2017 and started using dirty rags to bandage themselves in 2018. Their all-time low came at the Face It London Major, a straight-up last-place exit and the last time the Poles would ever appear at the pinnacle of Counter-Strike again. They were just shit, and they kept cycling in a myriad of underdeveloped, underwhelming Polish players, obviously not doing anything to help. At best, they were an okay tier 2 team, but even saying that feels so underwhelming. VP and most of the community too began to tire of the Polish project and started to set their sights elsewhere, officially benching what was left of the Polish squad and acquiring Avangard on December 16th, 2019. Little did everyone know at the time that this project would reveal something more, the deeper rotting core of Virtus.pro. Even though Avangard weren't notable in any sense at the time, they had a couple of good tournaments like their wins in DreamHack Open Rio and the We Play Forge of Masters, but with no other top level appearances, they should have crashed out in stage 1 of the Berlin Major. They made the grand final! And this impressed VP so much they decided they wanted to keep. So upon dropping the Polish lineup, the roster consisting of Buster, Kicker, Sandri, Adren and Jame, with Coach Dastan, would join VP. And... Avangard were a bona fide tier 2 team, and one run at the major wasn't going to change that. As the scene descended into the online era, VP were reduced to playing in qualifiers and tier 2 cups. At least back then, the major cycle still featured CIS regional tournaments, where VP proved that they were the best in show in their local scene. But on the international stage, the team was average at best. The one positive was that they were operating in a region stacked with diamonds in the rough, players that could be unearthed and brought up to change the game. This would allow them to sign the players that led the team on an incredible dark horse run at IEM Rio 2022, where they went on to win the entire event and bring another major trophy to VP. To say this came as a surprise was an understatement. At most, the team expected to end in groups, but it all ended up being a fluke though, as afterwards they continued to play mostly tier 2 competitions and kept declining in performance. With the types of exciting CIS players unearthed in the last few years, you have to wonder how VP never came across these guys. Instead, they decided to sign the famous major winning player Electronic, who's known for being very mentally stable and easy to work with, and is definitely going to be a great fit in an inexperienced team like this. And yet, they still kept losing. Virtus.pro were described as the most boring team in CS, a characteristic of what was thought to be Jame's leadership style, playing the slowest kind of game in history. That was fine when they were winning majors, but now they were villainized and sights were set on Jame's competence. With Electronic having a mild Nico complex and wanting to IGL, it was not surprising that Jame ended up getting benched in December of 2024. And let me tell you, the community euphoria was off the motherfucking scale. Finally, this unbelievably boring playstyle was no more, and the team could finally start to get back to winning ways. With this roster move, VP also started taking in some key rising talents from tier 2 CS, like Icy, who had succeeded on Amcal but was struggling on Cloud9, and Flammus, a criminally underrated entry who broke out on Omega and established himself as a high potential player on Gamer Legion in 2024. Both new additions formed the VP that looked set to rise back to relevance. Except they didn't. Instead, VP got absolutely exposed in Tier 1. Electronic was clearly not the IGL that Jame was. The stars and key players of VP's lineup were misused and mispositioned, most clearly evident with the form drop-off of Flammus, which genuinely, seriously infuriates me. This guy was one of the hottest prospects on his breakout team Omega. I watched him rip through the entire tier 2 scene, and he only got better on Gamer Legion. To watch a player go from top form to absolute trash is definitely on the shoulders of Virtus.pro. And people were quick to point out how his position and role had changed after his move to the team. I'm no expert, but to me that indicates the IGL didn't know how to use his pieces, or the coach has no idea what he's doing. Hi, it's Eternal J from the edit here. Just wanted to let you know that this video was written and recorded before Flammus was loaned to BetBoom and before IEM Atlanta had taken place. So just wanted to add this quick insert here to say, boy, wasn't I right? We've been remiss not to mention the coaches so far, because there hasn't really been a particularly bad example. But here, Passionoy was not qualified for this job. In a region most stacked with mastermind coaches, the likes of Navi's Blade, Gambit's Groove, or Spirit's Halley, they've decided to take a player who's had a completely unremarkable playing career, and it feels like he was only promoted from analyst to coach because they couldn't get anyone else. What a completely foolish idea, especially considering the players they had. My working theory is that Electronic called around himself as the star entry, and when it didn't work, Passionoy didn't have the chops to challenge a literal major champion. And if that theory is correct, then what the hell are you doing here? Even more so when their previous coach, Dastan, was a much more competent major winner who VP's management let go due to unknown reasons. Because, you know, they've never done that before. 2025 was bang average at best, with the best placing coming at the start of the year with the top 6 at IEM Katowice. They missed the playoffs of the major and placed even last in some top-level competition. And what did VP do to rectify this? Sweet FA. It took half a year to make a lineup change, and when they did, the floodgates opened. Flamish bench for Perfecto, Electronic bench to pass IGL duties to Perfecto, the ever-growing bench was cleared out, coaching changes, and call-ups from the academy team just to pad numbers. But this led to another huge problem. By this point, Counter-Strike has switched to the Valve ranking system, and it's here we realise that Virtus.pro have absolutely no idea what the VRS even is. In fact, I believe they didn't even make an attempt to understand the rankings. All these changes, shuffling the core around and the constant low effort finishes were just chipping away at their points, and the worst of all, their complete refusal of invites to lower level tournaments. They didn't even try to make up the missing points. I understand that VRS is a complicated system, especially back then, because by God, I've gotten it wrong in more recent times, but this is a fully professional, 2-time major winning organization with a fully paid set of backroom staff and roster. Why did no one start to do shit with this? They played in fewer tournaments in 2025 than 2024 in a circuit where you need to consistently place high in multiple events to earn points to qualify for tournaments. And it's this complete incompetence that would once again lead to their inevitable downfall. To top it all off, their former captain would be the one to directly punish them for it. If you've seen my Paravision video, you might already know the background here. Paravision were a pretty mid-team until Jame got benched from VP and he was brought into IGL for Paravision. I personally wasn't looking forward to this, as James Virtus.pro was pretty awful to watch and I didn't want to see another snail's pace team try to climb the rankings there. But then something unique happened. They started winning. A lot. They started winning so much that all they needed was one good LAN event to get them qualified to the major. Enter LAN to LAN. LAN to LAN was a Russian event that effectively qualified Paravision to the major, thanks to essentially farming points against lesser teams. I didn't really do a good job of explaining the VRS component in that video, but I stand by the basic premise that in that 6-month period, they only took 2 wins over top 30 teams on LAN. VP, by contrast, had 12. Which of those 2 records do you think is more appropriate to qualify for a major? But with most of these wins heavily decayed by the time the major invites were sent out, this was a prime event for Virtus.pro to come to a local LAN, get some simple wins, and contest against developing rivals to protect their spot at the major. But Virtus.pro did absolutely nothing. They fit the criteria to receive an invite, as far as I can tell, they just didn't accept. Given what BetBoom and Paravision were doing at the time, I think it's pretty unlikely that they would have maintained their position, but my problem is the lack of an attempt to try and compete. There was one other ranked LAN to LAN before, and whilst I understand the political situation makes it difficult for Russian players to travel internationally, VP travelled to Katowice, Cluj-Napoca, Bucharest, Cologne, and Copenhagen with attempts to qualify for events at Lisbon and London. So what's their excuse for not attending a Draculan or something? They did nothing to protect their spot. Why? I ain't got a clue. As far as I can tell, either they didn't understand how VRS worked, didn't think their tier 1 losses would be that huge an impact, or just had too much hubris to stoop down to the levels of the tier 2 scene. Either way, the management, backroom, and players didn't even try. And after missing the Budapest major, this caused more changes in the VP camp. In fact, it caused an entire rebuild. And it's here we realize that Virtus.pro have no idea what they're doing. This wasn't a real rebuild, it was a promotion. But you see, VP's academy team, VP Prodigy, was ticking away in the background, doing, well, nothing of any worth, to be honest. Unlike many of the academy squads that have found success, Prodigy didn't sell or promote any generational talent, nor did they offer any tangible threat to the tier 2 level. They are an afterthought academy team in a scene that's stacked with talent. Think about that for a second. An org based in one of the most talent-stacked regions who already suffered from a lacking talent pipeline in the past created an academy team that they didn't bother to develop into an appropriate talent pipeline. When Na'Vi Jr. brought Munacy to the Tier 1 forefront, when Spirit Academy unearthed Donk, when Mal's NXT were finding players from far weaker scenes and reforming their entire first team around them, VP Prodigy were doing none of that. And this is where VP thinks their solution is going to come from. It started with Toro and Bist, who were added to supplement the existing team in late 2025, and they were hardly setting the scene ablaze. Throughout January and February this year, VP would bench their existing old guard like Perfecto, Flit, and Fame, and call up Aqua RS and Forever to reform the VP Prodigy core, plus adding Mir, whose last project was VP back in early 2024. Like, I could go into a rant about how this team will absolutely fail, but do I need to? It's the most cynical way to field a roster in the current landscape of Counter-Strike. And the worst part is that they're going to be vindicated here, because this squad just won a LAN. I'm not going to get into the weeds on the matches themselves. All I'll say is that I'm not as impressed as much as the public seems to be, and I doubt it will go this well again. VP could have picked up WW, Sparta, who were on the market as Whitebird at the time, or even Illwill, and had more immediate success and likely long-term success too. Illwill were ranked 25th in the world on VRS at the time of writing, and still had their IGL at the start of March. That's a whole package team that has had a lot more proven potential than these guys. Maybe there's something in these players that nobody else has noticed yet, but I actively cast Prodigy matches, and right now, all I'm seeing is a Tier 3 team at best. Let me say that again. VP are a Tier 3 team at best. How did it come to this? That's a genuine question, by the way, because there's so much stuff that just makes no sense whatsoever. I've tried reaching out to people that are more in the know than me on this stuff, but no one's responded to me. I'd like to think that's because there's some sort of gag order in VP's contracts. There's like an in perpetuity clause, but it's probably just because I'm a commentator YouTuber with like 1,000 subscribers. Now's probably a good time to say something like, subscribe and hit the like button to see my next video in 6 months' time, because God forbid I can actually do this and balance with my regular job. It took years of stagnation, poor decision making, controversies, and just general mismanagement to get us to where we are today. Those of us who reflect on the good old days of the Virtus.pro may wish for those days to return, but let's be honest here, they are probably never going to come back. There are no more good players, there are no more tournament deep runs, there are no more tournament runs in general, actually. And it just seems like if it does happen again, it won't happen for a long, long time to come. Rome wasn't destroyed in a day, and neither was Virtus.pro.